Now, why is it so complicated to make a decent video about Erwin Rommel? Well, Rommel is very complicated for basically two reasons. First off, a lot of different groups have or had interest in portraying him in a certain way. And second, he's a complex character that offers various answers, and those answers are sometimes quite contradicting. As a result, we have various versions of the Desert Fox, and I use the term Desert Fox here intentionally instead of Rommel, because the Desert Fox is that part that nearly everyone wants him to be. So let's take a brief outlook on the various aspects we need to consider when we want to take a glimpse at Erwin Rommel and not just the Desert Fox. First off, Rommel was a highly decorated World War I veteran. He received the Pour le Mérite, the highest Prussian medal during World War I, as an infantry commander. This medal is quite well known as the Blue Max, and usually associated with fighter aces like Manfred von Richthofen, yet not with infantry commanders, which was a less glorified position. Now, to give you some indication on the relative difficulty in gaining the Pour le Mérite, it was awarded less than 700 times during World War I, whereas the regular Knight's Cross was awarded more than 7,000 times during World War II. Thus, Rommel basically had already celebrity status after World War I in German society. Additionally, shortly before World War II, he published his book about World War I, titled Infanterie greift an, or Infantry Attacks in English. These circumstances also earned him a great amount of respect from another World War I veteran, namely Hitler. Which brings us to the next part, Rommel's proximity to Hitler. Rommel was close to Hitler in many ways. Rommel was in charge of the security detachments during the annexation of the Sudeten areas, the drive into Prague, the annexion of the Memel territory, and the campaign in Poland. In this time, Hitler followed at least one suggestion from Rommel to drive to the fortress in Prague, which impressed Rommel, whereas Hitler was also impressed that Rommel strictly followed orders, and by doing so offending various high-ranking Nazi officials. Quite ironically for us, Rommel seems to have separated Hitler from the Nazi party, or at least most other Nazi officials. He was very positive about Hitler from pre-war until mid-war, but negative about the Nazi party members. But one thing is clear, Rommel's relationship with Hitler was rather close. Especially after reading some quotes, it seems those two had basically a little bromance going on. This relationship was probably the main reason why Rommel got his frontline command of the 7th Panzer Division for the invasion of France. After all, there were just a handful of those divisions available, and the request by Rommel was initially denied by army authorities. Not to mention that higher-ranking German army generals weren't so positive about Rommel. As odd as the relationship between Hitler and Rommel might appear to us nowadays, it was not so far-fetched. Both idolized each other for traits that they highly regarded. Both were frontline veterans of World War I. Both acted boldly and aggressively. Hitler restored Germany to power and gave it back its army, whereas Rommel was an ideal frontline commander in Hitler's eyes. Highly decorated, wounded in combat, and without a general staff education, something Hitler wasn't particularly fond of. Rommel wasn't the son of a Prussian aristocrat, like many of the German officers, but of a teacher. Similarly, Hitler also did not have an upper-class background. Today we would say both were self-made men, whereas a large part of their surroundings were, in their perspective, privileged, to use a contemporary term. As you can see, you can turn this information in different ways to portray Rommel in various forms. Hitler is well known for his ability to persuade people, being it in diplomatic meetings, with his generals, or in public speeches. So one can argue Rommel was just another one in millions that got seduced, tricked, or persuaded by Hitler. Or the other extreme would be that one that was so close to Hitler must have seen how evil he was. Whereas the various positions in between those extremes are rather hard to grasp, in a way also unsatisfying due to their lack, for a better word, fuzziness. And it doesn't get particularly clearer when we take a look at the death of Rommel. He was basically forced to kill himself in the months following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on the 20th of July 1944. Although some argue that Rommel was involved, there seems to be very little evidence for this claim. Rommel stated before and after the attempt that he was against killing Hitler, and considering that he once was in charge of a security detachment, this is very likely. Many generals that didn't have that job stated the same. Yet according to at least one author, one former member of the 20th of July plot tried after the war to create a national myth that Rommel was involved. And already during the planning phase, Rommel was considered the key person, because the conspirators believed that due to his popularity more soldiers would join their side, and that their plan with a separate peace with the Western Allies would have better chances with Rommel. Now, why was Rommel forced to kill himself? The short answer is some officers noted that he was involved, and additionally, a civilian member of the resistance that showed a major lack of operational security had papers that noted Rommel as a new Reichspräsident. Additionally, Rommel had quite many enemies. He was disliked by many in the higher echelons for his temperament, but also his influence with Hitler. Rommel actually suspected he would be sacked for losing the battle in Normandy, and had papers prepared. Yet he was taken by surprise when he was confronted with claims that he was involved in the 20th of July attack on Hitler. In order to save the life of his son and wife, he took the offer of suicide, and thus his family would be spared. Furthermore, officially it was declared that he died in an accident. Yet shortly after the war, his son announced that he was forced to kill himself. Similarly to the previous factor, you can turn this around in many ways, especially considering that shortly after the war, the 20th of July conspirators weren't held in high regard, something that changed later on. So depending on the agenda and time frame, you will find different arguments and different perspectives, supporting one or another claim. But let's take a short look at the military campaigns and theaters. Rommel fought against the British, US and Commonwealth forces in Africa, Italy and Normandy. In North Africa, he achieved several victories, especially against the British, and won against the US troops at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Additionally, Rommel fought against several highly popular Allied generals like Patton, Eisenhower and Montgomery. Now, why is this of importance? Well, for several reasons. The British after the war wrote quite many Rommel biographies. Since the British leadership and generals made various errors, such errors seems less crucial if you are fighting the Desert Fox. Additionally, those who defeated the Desert Fox must be great generals themselves. North Africa was quite important for the British, but probably the most important theater of the Western Allies was Normandy. After all, Rommel was put in charge in reinforcing the Atlantic Wall in France and thus fighting against the D-Day invasion, which is one of the best known battles in military history. Another aspect is that Rommel was seen positively by the Allies during the war for his overall conduct and good treatment of prisoners of war. This earned him the respect of Allied officers. So in a way they sometimes were positive portrayals of Rommel, but probably also out of respect and being an honorable victor. Especially since he could not defend himself anymore. We should not forget about early post-war literature, that these men had been fighting each other for years in the largest conflict in human history. Just 2 decades after the previously largest war in history. It is very likely that some of them first and foremost wanted peace and pay their respect to a highly regarded opponent. Something we can hardly blame them for, yet something we should be very aware of when we are reading such accounts, because we are responsible for getting the facts straight. The veterans already did their part by fighting the war. Which brings us to the next part, the post-war situation. Germany rather fast became the new ally of the British, French and United States in Europe. For this, a rearmament of Germany was also the key, which also meant that former Wehrmacht officers and soldiers were part of the newly formed armed forces of Germany, the Bundeswehr. Thus it was necessary for Germany and to a certain degree also NATO to have a clean Wehrmacht general to fall back to. Since Rommel had served mainly in France and North Africa, whereas nearly every other German general, and especially those who were very well known, like Guderian, Manstein and Model, served on the Eastern Front. Why is this important? Well, war crimes and atrocities were very common on the Eastern Front, whereas North Africa and France were for the most part, let's say, civilized. Thus Rommel was a central figure that was accepted by former Western allies and Germany as an honorable officer that was respected by friend and foe. One person most people could agree upon, and in such a way that Desert Fox was probably a political necessity. Additionally, Rommel offered another benefit most other generals didn't offer. He was dead. He couldn't say anything that caused trouble, unlike some other generals. He couldn't write a biography, nor was he tried at Nuremberg. And as previously mentioned, he died saving his family from the Nazis. Thus he died an honorable death even by contemporary standards. Or to put it very bluntly, Germany and its new allies needed a German hero, and for politics, dead soldiers are usually the best heroes. Which brings us to the final point. Ongoing contemporary issues that didn't change over the years. Namely, people want to tell a simple, clear, and usually quite single-minded narrative. For them, the guiding principle is simply to paint a black and white picture of a person, a group, a time period, or basically the world. To conclude, there was and still is the Desert Fox, and there was Erwin Rommel. In short, the Desert Fox offered nearly everyone major benefits. The Germans had their hero that they needed at the time, The officers that condemned the assassination could argue that Rommel was against it and kept his oath. Those that didn't could also refer to him as one of their own, or at least as someone who was killed by the Nazis. The Allies had an excuse for their early mistakes, and additionally can state that they had beaten one of the greatest generals of all time in several battles. Additionally, they needed Germany in the Cold War, and some just wanted to pay their tribute to a respected opponent. Yet if we look at Erwin Rommel, it gets complicated, confusing and irritating. Similar to most Germans, Rommel was quite fond of Hitler, and also benefited from him. Something in Germany nobody wanted to be reminded of, quite understandably. You know, Hitler for post-war Germany was a bit like the ex-boy or girlfriend you don't want to be reminded of. Yet in this case, the whole world knows him, and not in a good way. Rommel made his fair share of mistakes in military terms, also the odds were more and more staked against him. Thus a sober assessment of Rommel's capabilities would diminish both his reputation and thus that of his opponent. Additionally, the Second World War in Europe was first and foremost won on the Eastern Front, but it was won by the Soviet Union, which was the new enemy. To a certain degree, Rommel was probably too big to fail in post-war Germany, due to his achievements in World War I, his achievements in World War II, and a lot of propaganda. And the general perception was that he was one of the few good Germans for all sides. And I personally think the Desert Fox was a necessary step for several decades after the war. And not a bad one, because let's face it, nobody was hurt, avoided justice, nor were there any negative consequences that come to mind. Something that can't be said about a lot of other issues regarding post-war Europe. But I also think there's no need for a Desert Fox anymore. I think we can finally lay him to rest and let Erwin Rommel take his place. Because I think he's an excellent reminder how complex and difficult life can be, and that sometimes there are no easy answers. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.